and Sala, a small village deep in the Congo basin. 1904. He held her severed hand like it was still warm. The flies had arrived before him. They clung to the blackened fingers, crawled through the folds of skin that once curled around his own. Her foot, just one, was beside it, caked in dried blood, the toes rigid like claws. Her name was Boali. She was 5, and she had not picked enough rubber. The smell was unbearable, not just of rot, but of burnt wood, damp earth, and something older, a scent that clung to death, to betrayal, to fear too old to scream. Her body was never found, only these parts, offered back as proof to a system that demanded blood for profit. Behind him, the village smoldered, huts flattened, the ashes still warm, somewhere under the ruins. Bodies twitched, not quite dead, not quite alive. The trees around them whispered, heavy with sap and secrets. A silence filled the jungle dense, waiting, like something watching. The soldier who brought the hand said nothing. His eyes were blank, lost behind layers of obedience and hunger. He had killed before. He would kill again. For a king he had never seen. In a war with no enemies, only quotas. There were baskets, dozens of them, woven from vine and sinew, some filled with rubber, others with hands. All counted, all weighed. This wasn't madness. This was inventory. And still no one came. No aid, no outrage, no God. Just ghosts. Because what happened here wasn't conquest. It wasn't civilization. It was a harvest. And it fed a monster whose name still stands on statues. But the jungle remembers, and so do the bones. He stood on the riverbank, cloak pristine, white against the red earth. Leopold II, soldier king, lauded by Europe's courts. In 1885, beneath gilded halls in Berlin, he offered hope civilization, abolition of slavery, enlightenment. What followed in Congo bore none of that promise. He spoke of water and progress. The forest answered with tears. Behind that facade, men with pale faces whispered in map rooms, tracing borders that would never belong to Congo's peoples, but to one man. They spoke of profit, of ivory and later rubber. Every stroke of ink on those blank maps sealed destinies. Names became territories. Congo was no longer a living land. It became a ledger. Local chiefs, once sovereign in their villages, received letters from ivory traders. Then agents demanding allegiance to a monarch they never heard of. Agents flicked cane switches, promised protection, then demanded allegiance and rubber. A handful of red beads, some metal trinkets. And suddenly, your village must deliver rubber. And if your men did not, they vanished, disappeared, without trial. In one camp, Chief Opondo stood trembling before a low-rank Belgian officer. The man measured him with steely eyes. "Quota," he said simply, pointing at an iron barrel. 200 kilos, every 2 weeks. No debate on returning home. Opondo found his fields abandoned, his children gaunt. There was no harvest. Rubber was worth more than food. He pressed his trembling fingers against the barrel's edge and felt the cold weight, not a tool, but a sentence. At night, in villages under pressure, drums no longer sang, only sobs. Mothers crouched near smoldering fires, watching their husbands stagger in, clothes torn, faces hollowed. They carried rubber. They carried shame. A child lay in the reach of smoke, ribs visible under skin tight with hunger. The crackle of the fire sounded like dry bones collapsing. In mission houses, white walls were slick with sweat and dread. Missionaries awakened at dawn to the rasp of coughing, or a child's last whimper. They counted bodies in makeshift shelters. Their journals speak of quiet annihilation. But outside those walls, on riverboats bound for Europe, cargo held crates of ivory and barrels of rubber. The contrast sang of betrayal. Civilization extracted from death, European officers rode through camps on horseback, boots splashing red mud. They carried revolvers and sawtooth whips. They doled out quotas and punishments, a crack in the wrist, a slash across the ribs. Sometimes they displayed a severed hand nailed to a tree. Village folk came in trembling lines, pressed into rows. One by one, they laid hands at the foot of the officer. A silent confession we paid our debt, even if we did not. Every handshake with Leopold was a layer of lacquer over brute violence. The civilization mission posters arrived in Antwerp, with smiling Congolese children reaching for books, but the posters did not show the skeletal frames behind boarded windows, nor the ghosts who marched riverbanks at dawn. The forest air weighed heavy. It stung the eyes. Coils of miasma rose from swampy ground. In villages, spared the whip for now. Villages whispered about disappearances, neighbors who walked into the woods and never returned. Others returned so broken they did not speak. Their eyes were empty hollows, their tongues twisted. They stood in silence, unclaimed by life. At the river, a canoe glided through thick mist before sunrise. 2 women rowed slowly, backs bent, their passengers silent children, arms wrapped around them like fragile bundles. They smelled of rain, of fear, of something else, something that tasted like loss. The sun crested, and they glimpsed European flags painted on upriver stations. The flags claimed order. In truth, the flags flew over slaughterhouses. Inside a rubber collection center, men worked like automatons, bare feet pressed into a sticky red sludge underfoot. Their skin shone with sweat and sap. Rats scurried between their legs. A low humming whip cracks, groans, grinding of sap buckets against wooden planks. Elderly men pushed sapels over the rims of barrels with trembling arms. Younger men staggered. Coughs rattling through torsos, starved of nutrition. At shift's end, the bodies were counted, the missing counted, the dead counted, the hands collected, hands tied in bundles, weighed. Each one a currency, a sign of fulfillment, each one a testament to the false promise of humanitarian progress. Leopold's promise had become a contract for misery. The world believed in the mission, but here, beneath the canopy, men carried the weight of that lie in their bruised hips, their haunted eyes, their vivisected lives. In Antwerp and London, Leopold slept in plush beds. He spoke of Congo as his personal property. He never saw the hands in baskets, never smelled the rot in the villages, never touched the fever that killed thousands overnight. Yet his power stretched across rivers, through villages, into coffins. And so began the terror, not as conquest, but as commerce, not via scars on maps, but scars on flesh. And the forest never forgave what Europe took. Rain fell slow and heavy, like the forest was mourning itself. Somewhere near Lake Tumba, a man named Matuli dragged a basket along a muddy path. It was too large for him. His back was arched, his bare feet slipping in the earth soaked with rot and rain. He was 15. His hands were calloused and bleeding. The skin between his fingers split open from rubber sap. He did not cry. He had cried yesterday, and the soldier beat him for it. In the basket were bundles of latex, sticky and half-cured. Not enough. Never enough. 2 soldiers from the Force Publique watched him with rifles across their laps. One whistled softly. The other cleaned his fingernails with a bayonet. They said nothing. They didn't have to. Inside the village, a woman screamed not from pain, but from loss. Someone was missing. Maybe her husband, maybe her son, or maybe she had just seen what was left of them. The quota system was not a rule, it was a weapon. Every man had to deliver 4 kilograms of dry rubber every 2 weeks. But the vines were picked clean. The sap ran thin. They scraped trees until bark peeled like skin. Still not enough. And when they failed, when nature itself failed, Force Publique came. They didn't just kill, they made examples. Children were taken. Women tied together with rope. Marched away barefoot into the trees. Entire families disappeared into the silence. Sometimes, only a hand was returned. Sometimes, just a foot. It was a warning. Left on a doorstep. One man, old and hunched, refused to leave his hut. He wrapped himself in a faded cloth and whispered to spirits. A soldier dragged him into the open. He was missing one eye. The soldier offered no words, just pointed the rifle and fired. His blood sank into the mud like it belonged there. And always the hands. Each bullet used by force publique had to be accounted for. A severed hand was the proof. If you shot someone, you cut off their hand and brought it back. If you missed, you might still need to bring a hand, someone's hand, anyone's hand. So soldiers roamed with baskets, not of food, not of tools, of hands. They hacked them from corpses, from the living, from the dead who hadn't died yet. They brought them in like taxes. Captain Ram, a Belgian officer, once decorated his garden with skulls. He was not the only one. At outposts along the Congo River, skulls lined paths like stones, silent and white beneath the sun. To the officers, they were trophies. To the villagers, they were warnings from God. In the camp of Wando, a mother named Elika watched her son dragged away. His name was Sabwe. He was 8. He had tried to run. They caught him at the riverbank. The soldier didn't kill him. Instead, he made her watch. 2 days later, Sabwe's hand was returned to her in a cloth sack. Elika stopped speaking. She sat in the same spot for days, arms locked around her knees. Her face became still, like bark. The other villagers began to avoid her. She was alive, but not here. And this, too, was the point. Force publique didn't need to kill everyone. Just enough. Just often enough. They needed people to fear their own breath, to fear sleep, to fear leaving their children alone. A village near Bumba once hid their rubber quota in clay jars underground. They hoped to offer it late. When the soldiers arrived and found only half the rubber, they took 20 children, lined them up, and pointed rifles at their knees. One officer shouted, "Next time! Dig faster!" Then they fired not to kill, but to break. The children didn't walk again. This was not a war. This was a harvest, with quotas instead of generals, and sap instead of blood. The forests fell quiet in those years. No singing, no drums. Even the birds moved differently. Startled by the sudden silences, smoke hung in the canopy like a stain that would not lift. In Leopoldville, agents sat behind desks and counted barrels. They wrote letters to Brussels about productivity, about efficiency, about native cooperation. They drank wine with meals. They sent home photographs of rivers and sunsets. They did not speak of hands. And somewhere far away, in a marble palace in Brussels, King Leopold II read their reports and smiled. He never visited Congo, not once, but every week, shipments arrived with ivory, rubber, and gifts from agents. He decorated his gardens, built monuments, founded museums. With Congo's wealth, he turned Belgium into an empire of glass and gold. And all the while, the hands kept coming. Edmund Morel sat at his desk in the port of Antwerp, staring at the ledgers with a growing sense of unease. He had read thousands of shipping manifests before. But this one was different. Every week, steamships docked in the harbor. From Congo, they arrived bulging with crates of rubber and ivory cargo of extraordinary value. But on their way out, not cloth, not tools, not medicine, just rifles, gunpowder, chains, ammunition. He ran his fingers down the smooth parchment. His skin felt suddenly cold. This wasn't trade. This was armed robbery. The numbers told a story no one else seemed to notice. Congo was bleeding wealth, but sending nothing back in return except fear. Morel rose from his chair, walked to the window, and watched the smoke spiral from the ship's stacks. Something twisted inside him. like he'd glimpsed the edge of a veil he wasn't meant to lift. And then he did something no one expected. He quit. Gave up his career, gave up comfort, and built a war of words. In the small, damp room he turned into an office, Morel filled the walls with maps, photos, letters. He started a paper, the West African Mail, and used it like a blade. His words were sharp, relentless. He named names, quoted agents, published accounts smuggled from Congo, day by day. He peeled the mask off Leopold's lie. But ink alone wasn't enough. In 1904, in a clearing surrounded by burnt-out trees, a woman raised a camera to her face. Alice Seeley Harris had come to Congo with the Bible. Not a lens. She believed in missions, in Christian light, in the promise that Europe had something to offer Africa. But what she saw burned all of that away. She met Nsala of Walla, sitting in the dirt, cradling something in his lap. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. Then she saw a tiny hand, a foot, severed, blackened by days in the sun. They belonged to his 5-year-old daughter. Boali, killed for not meeting her quota. The expression on his face blank. Beyond sorrow haunted her. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if memory itself had become poison. She clicked the shutter. The photograph hissed through the developing bath like a whisper from the dead. It became one of over 300 images she would take children with stumps for arms. Mothers holding nothing but ashes. Villages torched to the foundations. She returned to England with more than film. She carried testimony, and she showed it. Church halls, universities, theaters, wherever she could gather a crowd. She projected Boali's hand onto a canvas 12 feet tall. People gasped, some turned away, others wept openly. But once seen, the image couldn't be unseen. She didn't scream, she didn't rage, she simply held up the truth, frame by frame, and let silence do the rest. Her campaign caught the attention of a man who'd spent years staring into the heart of empire. Roger Casement, Irish, by blood. British by duty, was a diplomat used to the machinery of empire. But what he found in Congo stunned even him. He arrived in 1903. What he expected were misunderstandings, perhaps excessive punishments. What he found were ghosts walking in daylight. He traveled on foot for months, through jungle and disease, sleeping in hammocks, scribbling notes under mosquito nets. He interviewed hundreds of victims, their stories blurred into one another, hands taken. Villages burned, children murdered in front of their mothers, always the quotas, always the rubber, always the hands. He listened to a man who had survived being hung by his arms until his shoulders dislocated. Another whose wife had been raped by soldiers, while their son was held down nearby. Another who pointed to the stump where his right foot had been chopped off after he collapsed from exhaustion in the forest. Casement did not flinch. He wrote everything down. His final report ran over 40 pages. It named companies, described punishments, quoted survivors word for word. When it was published in 1904, it exploded across Europe like a funeral bell. No longer could Belgium claim ignorance. No longer could Leopold hide behind the lie of civilization. The crimes were now named, the numbers documented, the photographs undeniable. But the king fought back. His press agents flooded newspapers with counter-stories, images of happy natives, statistics about schools, lies upon lies printed in elegant fonts. He paid off publishers, attacked Morel, discredited Harris, questioned Casement's patriotism. Still, the tide was shifting. In Washington, in Paris. In Berlin, diplomats began to whisper Leopold had become inconvenient. His atrocities were no longer secret. They were scandal, and scandal threatened trade. In Congo, nothing had changed. The rubber still bled, the hands still piled. But something was stirring in awareness, a fracture in the wall of silence. Morel kept writing. Harris kept showing. Casement prepared for a tribunal. 3 voices, distant from one another, yet echoing the same truth. in the heart of Leopold's empire. Something began to rot, not the jungle, but the myth. And from that rot, the truth would soon claw its way to the surface. The numbers were never written in ink. They were carved into bone. Before the Belgians came, the land now called Congo pulsed with voices over 200 languages carried through forest and river. Markets buzzing with salt and cloth. Rituals passed from palm to child's hand. Songs had names. Rivers had stories. Every tree, every bend in the water, had memory. Then came the quotas. By 1924, entire regions no longer spoke. Not because they had forgotten, but because those who remembered had died. Among the Lulua people, a chieftain once danced barefoot across dry soil, face painted with red clay, leading his village into festival. Years later, the same ground lay still. Only children remained. Orphans, sick with fever, too young to say who their parents had been. A woman stirred cassava root over an empty fire and whispered into a gourd not for prayer, but for sound. Any sound. Half the land had gone mute. In missionary records, the handwriting grew shakier as the years passed. Whole villages vanish overnight. One wrote, "We find only sandals, or bowls, sometimes a cradle." They stopped counting names, started counting objects. Survivors were harder to find than ghosts. Estimates said 10 million. But there are no photographs of 10 million bodies, no grave large enough to hold their names, no census that counted the unborn. The children who starved after their fathers were taken. The women who bled out alone in burned huts. The numbers bled between generations, between trees. In one remote hill settlement, a girl named Ilunga once knew 30 words for the color green jungle. Moss, fruit, vine, storm. She knew how to weave mats that held rain. By the age of 10, she could no longer speak. When she was rescued by a missionary in 1909, she responded to every voice with the same twitch, a startled shiver. Eyes wide, her hands stayed clenched into fists, as if still trying to hold on to something invisible. Congo's body did not just suffer wounds, it was dismembered. Entire dialects vanished. Ancestral drums rotted in silence. Birthrights were skipped. Marriage traditions dissolved into fear. When communities dissolve, the past is severed from the living. And Leopold did not just take rubber, he took memory. At Leopold's direction. Rubber became a god in the plains. A man named Kakule once tilled soil with his brothers after conscription. He returned a skeleton. His teeth had fallen out from disease. His hands were covered in thick scabs. He had forgotten how to pray. His fields were gone. His wife buried. He wandered through the high grass for weeks, speaking to no one, digging up handfuls of dust and rubbing them into his eyes. He was not mad. He was trying to make the world disappear. The hunger came next. Farms abandoned. Markets collapsed. No time to grow millet or sorghum when every waking hour was spent chasing rubber vines. People ate bark, boiled roots until they were mush. When the rains came, they collected water from potholes made by soldiers' boots. They buried infants in shallow graves because the ground was too hard to dig deep. Disease followed the hunger. Sleeping sickness turned men into statues still. Breath shallow, eyes open but empty. Smallpox blackened villages overnight. Dysentery bloomed through rivers. When one elder saw his third child die, he walked into the jungle and never came back. His neighbors said he had gone to find the forest's forgiveness. By 1907, the death toll was impossible to conceal. Missionaries reported regions emptied of life. Hunters returned to silent woods. A man said he tracked an antelope for 2 days and found no footprints, not of prey, not of people. And yet, Leopold's fortune soared. From the vines, he extracted 70 million francs, equivalent to billions today. With it, he built monuments, arcades, fountains, in Brussels. A vast palace rose, its marble columns carved by artisans who never saw the source of their king's wealth. A gift from Congo. The plaque read, "A gift soaked in blood." The economic genius of Leopold's system was in its cruelty. He paid nothing for labor, because labor was chained. He bought rubber for pennies, sold it for gold. The profit margins reached 4,000%. Not even oil had ever brought such gain. But the price was extinction. Some tribes lost 75% of their population. Others, 90. Forest routes that once sang with merchants and drum signals now echoed with nothing but birds and the crunch of boots. The dead left no heirs. The survivors left no songs. The land itself seemed to grieve. In one photograph, taken by a British officer, the sun filters through a broken canopy over a clearing filled with white bones. No markers, no names, just silence. The caption reads, "Rubber Station, 7/1903. Nothing more." A Congolese man who witnessed the years later said, "We did not die once. We died every time we remembered." Leopold never answered for it. He said nothing of the famine, nothing of the culture erased, nothing of the millions lost. He spoke only of economic development, of progress. He called the critics jealous, the victims lazy natives. He never saw a single grave. But the graves saw him. And now, as we recount these bones and names and absences, we must ask, what do we mean when we say a king ruled what is empire? If not a silence so vast, it drowns entire peoples. The answer was written not in books, but in the soil, in the air above the rivers, in the breath of the last child who still remembered the words her mother once sang. The fire burned for 8 days, inside the royal palace in Brussels. Men fed documents into iron furnaces by the armful, by the crate, ledgers, orders, personal letters, reports from Congo's jungle outposts. Flames flickered against the marble walls, licking centuries from paper to ash. The heat warped the chandeliers. The smoke climbed through gilded ceilings like a curse uncoiling. The order came directly from King Leopold II. "Burn it all," he said. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the cold weight of ownership of a man who had ruled not just people, but their memories. "They have no right," he said once, "to know what I did there." Outside, in the streets of Brussels, gas lamps flickered against wet cobblestones. Few knew what the smoke meant. The public had heard rumors, pressure from foreign governments, troubling images in newspapers, whispers from missionaries. But inside the palace, Leopold lit the match on history itself. One archivist, young, with ink-stained fingers, hesitated before tossing a folder into the furnace. It bore the seal of the Congo Free State. He opened it just briefly. Inside, a photograph of a man with no arms, a shipping invoice, a note written in rushed French, 25 hands delivered, 12 bullets expended. He stared too long. A supervisor snatched the folder and flung it into the flames. "Do not read," he hissed. "Obey." And so the silence began. After the fire, the king walked the halls of his estate in Laeken with measured steps, as if each pace was calculated to erase memory. He did not weep. He did not pray. Instead, he summoned sculptors, architects, patrons of the arts. He began to build. A triumphal arch in Brussels, a vast museum in Tervuren, dedicated to African exploration, gardens with bronze elephants, murals showing tamed savages receiving books from bearded white men. No hands, no rubber, no blood. In marble bas-reliefs, the Congo became a fable, a fairy tale written by its butcher. For decades, school children recited poems to the Builder King. Teachers spoke of Leopold's vision, his philanthropy. No one mentioned Matuli, or Boali, or the girl Ilunga who forgot her language. Maps and textbooks showed borders, but no scars. Belgium moved on upward, outward, richer. Even the dead were not allowed to speak. In the Royal Museum for Central Africa, bones were mislabeled, artifacts stripped of context. Villagers shown smiling beside missionaries, all frozen in sepia lies. Tour guides spoke of agriculture, development, Christianity. They skipped the part where people were starved, whipped, mutilated. In one exhibit, a young guide once paused beside a photograph of a rubber collection station. "They worked very hard," she said softly. Her voice trembled. "But we don't talk about that." No, they didn't, because silence became policy. In the archives of Belgian universities, scholars who requested access to colonial records were stalled, redirected, or flatly denied. One professor in 1972 wrote, "It is easier to study the fall of Rome than the rise of Leopold." Another researcher received only heavily redacted documents, whole pages blacked out, as if the ink itself refused to remember. But memory is stubborn, and bones do not burn so easily. In Kinshasa, elders still whispered stories around late-night fires, of men who vanished into the trees, of babies buried in unmarked graves, of gods who turned their faces away. These stories never made it into textbooks, but they survived, passed in the hush between generations, too painful to speak aloud, too sacred to forget. In 2020, statues of Leopold began to fall. Young protesters, faces masked and fists raised, sprayed red paint across the king's bronze face. "Murderer." The graffiti read. Others threw ropes around his neck and pulled until metal groaned. The statue crashed into the stone below. Face cracked open, like a tomb no longer sealed. In a televised address, King Philippe of Belgium expressed regret for the suffering caused in Congo, but no apology, no admission of genocide. The silence shifted, but it did not break. Then, in 2024, a ruling came from a Brussels court. It concerned not 10 million deaths, not the quotas, not the fire, but a narrow case: the theft of mixed-race children from their Congolese mothers. They were declared victims of crimes against humanity. Justice. Perhaps, but only a sliver. Still no trial for Leopold. Still no charge. In one small room at the edge of the Tervuren Museum, a new plaque was installed beneath a faded portrait of the king. It read, "Contested legacy." Nothing more. Contested. For the dead. There is no debate. For the mutilated, the starved, the erased, there is no ambiguity. Leopold's silence was not forgetfulness. It was design. A silence with borders, with architecture, with ceremony. A silence taught in schools, celebrated in stone, and exported to the world as virtue. But silence does not erase pain. It only buries it. And some graves, even when hidden, will rise. The ground still opens. In southern Congo, under a sun that sears the backs of children too small for helmets, another hole is dug. No jungle, no river, just red earth torn by hands too young to vote, too poor to stop, inside the pit. A boy named Mbuyi hammers rock with a rod of steel. He is 7. His feet are bare, the skin cracked from acid and gravel. Dust clings to his eyelashes. His fingers are stained cobalt blue. This is not history. This is Tuesday. Mbuyi doesn't know the name Leopold. He knows the sound of whips replaced by the threat of no food. He knows the quota "fill your bucket." Again. Again. He knows what happens if the foreman returns and the weight is too low. He has seen what happens. Behind him, his older sister lifts sacks twice her size. Her left eye droops from a blow received last winter. No one asked her name. No one wrote it down. And yet, her sweat powers cities. Because cobalt powers the battery. The battery powers the phone. The phone powers the world. In polished offices 1,000 miles away, executives in tailored suits review quarterly reports. Their screens glow with maps, lines of logistics, circles of supply. Congo is one circle. They do not see the pit. They do not smell the blood-mixed dust. They do not hear the coughs. But the model is familiar. Maximize profit, minimize cost, suppress exposure. It is not called empire anymore. It is called efficiency. At the base of the pit, Mbuyi uncovers a chunk of ore the size of a skull. He calls for help. No one comes. The others are too tired. He lifts it alone. He stumbles. The rock splits his shin. Blood seeps into the earth. He cries out, not in words, but in sound. The same sound once heard under rubber trees, when soldiers took hands instead of cobalt. The plantation is gone, but the harvest continues. In Geneva, in Silicon Valley, in Seoul, names like Glencore, Apple, Tesla, Samsung line the walls of trade, shows, and tech expos. Their devices shine beneath white lights, promises of a future clean and green. But nothing is clean beneath the soil. Nothing is green inside a child's lungs. At the edge of a Congolese mine, a poster flaps in the wind. Innovation starts here. The irony cuts deeper than any blade. Elsewhere, the blueprint lives on. In Xinjiang, factories glow through sandstorm nights inside. Uyghur prisoners stitch clothes, sort cotton. No choice. No voice. Only quotas. Cameras track their movements. Guards watch through mirrored glass. In Myanmar, Rohingya, children walk barefoot across salted fields, forced to grow food for armies that burned their homes. Quotas again. Always quotas. In Yemen, mothers trade gold teeth for flour. Children dig trenches for militias. Drones hum above their heads. Somewhere, someone profits. These are not anomalies, they are echoes. And all of them trace back to the system Leopold refined: profit without personhood, resource without rights, image without truth. But something stirs. In coffee shops, people scan barcodes with apps that trace their chocolate back to child labor. In classrooms, students ask why their textbooks skipped the 10 million dead. In protest lines, voices chant not only for justice, but for memory. Organizations rise: Anti-Slavery International, Free the Slaves, Enough Project. They fight not for recognition but interruption, to slow the machine, to shine light into pits of shadow. In one town in Ohio, a woman named Dana sees a photo of a Congolese mine. She deletes an app, changes a supplier, talks to her son about Boali. Her voice shakes, but she does not stop. In Amsterdam, a museum replaces a bust of Leopold with a single empty chair. Beneath it, reserved for the unnamed. A child visitor asks who it's for. The guide doesn't answer. She just points to a photo, black and white. Faded. A basket of hands. And silence. And yet, not all is despair, because every act of remembrance is defiance. Every name recalled is a chain broken. And every time someone chooses truth over comfort, the empire trembles. Leopold's monuments may still stand in stone, but stone cannot bleed, and history, once silenced, has begun to speak. The photograph is small, faded at the edges. A man sits on a wooden bench, staring at the ground. His name is Nsala in his lap. 2 severed limbs, a tiny hand, and a foot. They once belonged to his daughter. Her name was Boali. She was 5. No monument marks where she died. No gravestone carries her name. But the image survives. In a dusty archive in London, the original print lies tucked inside a file. Someone once tried to label it Evidence, Case 67. But the ink has bled. The label fades. The image does not. You can still see Nsala's eyes. They do not weep. They do not blink. They look past the camera, past time itself, into something no one who hasn't buried their child that way could ever understand. He is not asking for help. He is not asking for justice. He is asking, are you still watching? Somewhere in Congo, the trees have grown tall again. Vines hang low. Rivers run slow over stones that once carried the blood of children. Villages rebuilt with different names. But the ground still remembers. Every root curls around silence. Every breeze hums with the weight of what was done. There is no sound in that photograph. And yet, if you listen closely, if you hold your breath, you might still hear her. In the rustle of a rubber leaf, in the gasp of a child lifting cobalt from the dirt, in the click of a shutter before the light vanishes. Bawali still screams, and this time, you heard her